Politics and Prose, on behalf of the owners and of the staff, I would like to welcome all of you to your favorite bookstore for this evening's event. As you may already know, Politics and Prose have gone back to hosting in-person events along with our virtual book events, partnered events, and trips and classes, so please check our website for a full list. A little bit of housekeeping before we start. First of all, please turn off or silence your cell phone so as not to disturb the event. For the Q&A, please remember to step up to the microphone by the pillar over here before asking your questions, so that we can ensure that the conversation is going to be recorded and everyone can hear. For those of you who want to buy copies of the book, we are selling them out front by the cash registers. We will be doing a signing after the Q&A, so if you'd like to get your book signed, please line up once again by the pillar over here. And lastly, once the event is complete, we ask that you fold up your chairs, lean them against something sturdy to help us out a bit. Now onto the main event. I am honored to introduce Ben Terris to all of you. Ben is a writer for the Washington Post Style section with a focus on national politics, and this evening he will be talking about his new book, The Big Break: The Gamblers, Party Animals, and True Believers Trying to Win in Washington While America Loses Its Mind. The book is an investigation into the cogs and gears that make DC tick. It is a fascinating account of the many opportunists and idealists that populate Washington, D.C., and how they make the system work for them to achieve their desired goals, whether they be selfless or selfish. Tonight, Ben will be in conversation with Zoe Chace. Zoe is a producer at This American Life since 2015. Before that, she was a reporter for NPR's Planet Money team, as well as an NPR producer. Everyone, let us all welcome Ben Terris and Zoe Chace.
One, two. Does this work?
Hello.
Hi. I don't know if we need these. Can you hear me? Is this on? Okay. Oh, so we do need them, is what you're saying. Okay. Okay. Hi. Thanks for coming. Okay, I'm going to start. I just wanted to say, so I'm Zoe Chace. I'm a radio reporter, a mere public radio reporter. And I will say that often public radio reporters will cower in the shadows of a place like the Washington Post. But we also have this feeling like we are more entertaining than the print reporters at the Washington Post. And I have to say that when Ben asked if I would do this with him, I was like, okay, because Ben is basically, he is a radio reporter in print, which is like the nicest thing I can say about a print reporter, and it's something I almost never say. But Ben is like very, very, very special reporter. You guys are probably really familiar with his work. But if not, you're gonna see that like he makes you live inside the places that he's reporting in. And it feels like the radio when you're reading it. And he's just very wonderful and very unique. And you will be able to tell this just from the very beginning of the book. So you should start with a reading from just the beginning, like the first couple of pages.
Sure. Well, thank you. That's very nice. I wish I could be on radio, but
You don't need to be, man.
yeah, well, thank you. All right, so I'm going to read from the prologue of the book, and it's called "Is Any of This Normal?" I'm in the business of making Joe Biden's agenda look more popular than it really is, Sean McElwee announced to the poker table, and business is booming. It was a July evening in 2021. Biden's presidency was 6 months old, his approval rating was hovering around 50%, and his agenda was on the move. Sean, the 28-year-old head of a Democratic polling group and think tank, was a few Miller High Lifes into one of his regular poker nights, hosted at his bachelor pad in Logan Circle, a recently gentrified neighborhood in Washington, just north of downtown. In the living room, a big screen television played Rounders, the 1998 Matt Damon poker movie that was canon among millennial gamblers. A guest bed lay in the corner, extra large pizzas and cheap beer cluttered the counter in the kitchen, and tubs of protein powder sat on the shelves. Sean was new to Washington and splitting his time with New York City, where he kept an apartment, but he had the vibe of someone who'd been around forever. He wasn't a pollster exactly. He hired experts to do the legwork there. And he wasn't a policy nerd. He wasn't a campaign guy either, although his nonprofit, Data for Progress, did work for campaigns. He was sort of all of these things, and sort of none of them. More than anything, he was a political evangelist. He was in the business of making Democrats popular, figuring out what legislation to prioritize, what phrases to stop saying, and he was in the business of making himself popular too. Since moving to town a few months earlier, Sean had managed to generate a gravity well, attracting other Democratic operators into his orbit. He hosted monthly happy hours that were well attended by professional progressives and establishment climbers. The boozy meetups were a way to see people and be seen, and it was hard to miss Sean. He was over 6 feet tall with a body type that fluctuated between lineman and linebacker. He had a signature look, translucent framed glasses and black t-shirts, an outfit he deviated from just enough to avoid comparisons to Steve Jobs, or worse, Elizabeth Holmes. Sean knew everyone, and every few weeks he invited a rotating cast of his happy hour crew over for poker. Tonight's table featured a spokesman for Facebook. "I work for our tech overlords," he said. A friendly former Senate staffer who now led an organization attempting, unsuccessfully, to end the filibuster. A former top aide to former Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid. A senior reporter who covered the Senate for MSNBC, and Gabe Bankman-Fried, the brother and political consigliere of the crypto billionaire Sam Bankman-Fried. Yeah. He had a lot of money to spend. Like any effective operator, Sean was good at getting close to people with money, or at least close to people who were close to people with money. He wasn't ultra wealthy himself, but he did all right. His salary was $180,000, and he started picking up lucrative consulting gigs on the side. He'd recently started doing work for Gabe's organization, Guarding Against Pandemics, which, backed by millions from Sam, was quickly becoming a powerhouse in Washington. One of Sean's main jobs for Gap was to hype their work at every opportunity. "The pizza is good," someone said at the table. "You know what else is good?" said Sean, looking at Gabe. "Pandemic prevention." The conversation bounced around from Democratic Senator Kyrsten Sinema's habit of screwing up her party's legislative agenda, Sean, "She has such bad politics, but she's so hot," to the question of whether Donald Trump would be president again, Sean, "He's a cooked turkey." There was talk, too, of the various recreational drugs used by different Democratic operatives. Apparently, ecstasy was a popular choice for one well-known data guru. No one here was a particularly serious poker player. They bought in for $100, bluffed one board. Sean especially was prone to wild swings in chip count. But Sean's biggest wagers had nothing to do with cards. They had to do with politics. Tonight, Sean had his eye on the upcoming Democratic primary in Ohio, where Shontel Brown, the establishment choice running with the backing of the Congressional Black Caucus, was up against Nina Turner, the former Bernie Sanders campaign staffer and progressive wing favorite, who once compared voting for Biden to eating a bowl of shit. Political observers had been watching this race closely ever since the outcome might hint at whether Democratic voters wanted to lurch to the left as the 22 midterms approached, for Turner, or stay the course, for Brown. Sean was betting it would be the latter, literally. He had placed bets online and stood to win $14,000 if Shontel Brown won. "I make a lot of bets that would make progressives cry," Sean said. "How many active bets would you say you have?" someone asked. "My inbox is so full of bets," Sean said, "I don't even remember what I have money on." "Do you make bets on races you're working?" The question lingered as the players seemed to mull the ethical implications. Betting on politics while working in politics? Betting on clients? Was this normal? Should it be? After a few seconds, Sean laughed. Who can say?
So that's Sean, and that's just like the very beginning of what is it like? Would you say it's like 5 or 6 are
Yeah,
the
there's like
main
five
characters?
main characters probably.
And they're all kind of wandering through Washington, and they're on their own little Icarus journey, which kind of gives away the end, but that's kind of in the title too. But okay, so I want to get into Sean, and I want to understand how you got access to that room, basically, because that's the thing that's like kind of the most exciting for me as a reporter when I read it, is like, how was he in there, and how are you taking your notes? But first, like, do a sort of thumbnail sketch of the book so that everyone's on the same page.
Sure. So the book is called The Big Break because obviously the country went through this kind of big break, with Donald Trump and people having no idea how politics worked anymore. But it's also about a whole cast of people in Washington searching for big breaks of their own in this kind of new landscape.
Right.
And so I found I don't know, like you said, 5 main characters, another 5 or 6 kind of secondary characters, to spend time with, to kind of figure out how Washington worked or didn't work or doesn't work anymore. And they weren't like the most famous people in Washington, but in my opinion, they're some of the most interesting people. Folks who are desperately trying to either get famous or rich or influential. And
Well, they're all placing bets.
they're placing bets. This is
That's
a
why
book.
this beautiful metaphor opens your beautiful book.
Yeah, there's a lot
if
of
I may
gambling
say.
here. It's either gambling, on politics literally, as Sean does, but also on, where the Democratic Party is going to go, or where the Republican Party is going to go, or how much you can put up with dealing with the horribleness of Washington in some ways.
Yeah.
And so it's characters from both the left, the right, pollsters, people behind the people, campaign folks, chiefs of staff, Hill staffers, that kind of thing.
And basically, like, you must have gone through a really intense casting process, because there's a story that you want to tell about Washington, or at least there's something that you want to find out through these people. So I guess, like, the question is kind of, how do these stories end up being connected? But first, like, how did you do the casting process? How did you figure out who were going to be your people?
Yeah, it was the hardest. Well, the whole book was hard, but it was
Yeah.
one of the hardest parts of the book.
I think so. Yeah.
And basically, the thing that made this book so difficult from the beginning is that I didn't know how it was going to end. Right? Like, this is a book about the first kind of 2 years of post-Trump, possibly pre-Trump Washington, and at the beginning, I didn't know how it was going to end, and so you can't know who's going to be the most interesting person. And so basically, I tried to find as many people as I could to kind of get in their orbit, people who would let me around, I could spend time with. And then it was be around, figure out who was interesting at the beginning, and then stick around till the end. And if they maintained their, level of, if I maintained my level of interest in them, if they were still part of the big story, if they had a dramatic rise or a dramatic fall, then I was in position to write about them. But it also meant spending time with a lot of people that I didn't write about.
Can you tell me about a moment where you were like, this person is going to work to tell the story that I want to tell? And then a moment where you were like, that one is not.
Sure.
I can't with them.
Well, from the beginning, Sean was a fascinating character. I mean, he let me in partially because he was desperate for attention, and he's one of the kind of Washington figures who believes in brand building. He believes all press is good press, and that ended up not really being true for him.
That's right.
Not to give away too much of the book, but that's not necessarily true. But being around him, he was both colorful in person, very quotable. He liked to say things to push the envelope. He wanted to offend, and he wanted to see if anyone would print it, and then
Yeah, and you were
I would
printing it. Like,
print
you
it.
printed,
I would
like,
print it.
he's like, what does he say? He's like, I'll believe, like, all bisexuals have long COVID.
Oh yeah, he said.
Or
at
like,
one-
the
at one-
only people I know who have long COVID are bisexual.
Right. He said
Which, like,
everyone who
makes
works for me.
intuitive sense.
He said he works at this polling organization with lots of young staffers, and he said everyone who works for me is bisexual and has long COVID. I'll believe that long COVID is a real thing when someone who's not bisexual has it.
Yeah.
And it's like I
Well
wrote
said.
that down right away. It's like, okay, that's hard to forget something like that. And so I knew from the beginning that he was colorful. I also knew that his place in Washington was important. He was somebody who was kind of on the rise, as I read. His polling was getting more pickup. He was working for important people. And if you can combine someone who's both interesting and in the mix, it's like, well, that's a person to write about. And then when he was gambling on politics, I would just like look around at everyone else, like, are you hearing this? And they'd be like, yeah, we're hearing that. Like, some of us are doing it too.
Yeah, like,
and
so he was placing bets on the very same people that he was researching polling data for.
yeah, and occasionally betting against them.
Yeah.
Like Pete Rose famously bet on baseball and it was a problem, but he always claimed that he never bet on games that he played,
Tim
and he
Donaghy.
certainly wouldn't have bet against the team, presumably. I don't know, but Sean would admit to all of it, and that was like pretty surprising.
Yeah. But also, like, I have to say, so I have some theories about your book, but like, one of them is the Democrats. So say this period is in between Trump time. There's like, we're in this little like wink of time in history that's in between the Trump times. And you would think that that would be like a really important time for the Democrats to like not have the second half of Trump time. But the Democrats in your book seem like they have no idea what the fuck they're doing. And like that is like interesting to see, because you want them, I think, to be like exploiting this moment of opportunity, but like they're lost a little bit. Like, well, Sean's like so cynical, and then there's this fundraiser who can't get any money because Trump's not there, or seems kind of lost because like there's no motivating factor of Trump. Like seeing the Democrats figure out what to do here in your book is like really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting for me too, and then watching how the election played out, like they did well. Like,
I know they were freaking out the whole time, and then they actually had like a good run.
Yeah, I mean,
was what
one
they
of
were
the
trying to
one of the things that I steal this from Evan, who's in Evan McMorris Santoro in the crowd over here, used to have a podcast called Nobody Knows Anything. Is that right?
Yeah.
Nobody Knows Anything? Close enough? Close enough. And to me, like that was sort of my experience in
Yeah.
reporting this book, is like people were freaking out thinking they were going to lose and they won. People were sure they were going to win and they lost. The problem with this moment in time for Democrats especially, but also Republicans, is it was really hard to define yourself, right? When Donald Trump was in the White House, it was very easy to be like, we are against that, or we are for that. And then when Donald Trump is out of the White House and Democrats are in charge, they have to say, well, this is what we stand for. And that was really hard because it's a coalition of lots of different people who believe in lots of different things. They have, general beliefs, but then it became a fight about all the other stuff. And watching that in real time was fascinating. And then for Republicans who could no longer just be like, we are for the guy
Right.
that's our guy, it was even kind of
It's
worse.
weird. Like they're like spinning their wheels. It seems simpler. Like they're like, we're just trying to figure out like where we are and up, like in proximity to Trump. And then the Democrats, though, they're supposed to be doing their own thing, but they can't like quite get started on their own thing or something.
Yeah, I mean, look, they got a lot done, especially early on. Big bills and lots of spending, and there was this kind of moment of like, oh, we got this. Like we're doing the things that we want to do. We are getting money to people. We are getting vaccines and arms, all that kind of stuff. And then it got to the point where the momentum kind of slowed down, and everybody could see, oh shoot, Republicans might win. Like Donald Trump is not gone. Like it doesn't matter how many times we try to vanquish this guy, he's around. And so the worry like really kind of took over a lot of people. One of the early scenes in the book is at a Christmas party that's held by progressives, and they're like, they should be kind of celebrating, while the next party I go to is Republicans, and they should be down in the dumps. But really, it's sort of the other way around. It's like, oh, the darkness is coming for Democrats, and Republicans feel like, oh,
They're so high.
yeah, we're about to take this back.
Yeah. I mean, I think that what I like so much also, though, about spending time inside the world of your book is it's like, it's not sort of analysis where you're next to the politicians or sort of next to like the people, I guess, that would be like calling the shots up top. It's like, it's the people that are sort of satellites around it. And what that allows for, I think, this is something that you do. Okay, well, this is a couple of theories that I have. So something that you do so well is you foreground a lot of times personal relationships with the characters that you're following. And the politics are sort of like right behind it, because in some ways, like these people, through their personal relationships, through their personal motivations, are shaping like what's going on. But the way that most of us experience sort of what's going on in America a lot of times, I think, like, is that way. It's like through your like actual personal relationships, rather than being sort of the one that's like trying to make a bill happen or whatever. And so basically what I'm saying is like there's this amazing kind of breakup that you chronicle, that's with the guy that like used to be the sort of CPAC flack, and the guy who started CPAC, and the feelings that he has about this breakup, they just are the complicated feelings that so many Republicans have been having, but they happen via this one close personal relationship, which I think is sort of the most human experience that people are having. Can you tell that story?
Yeah, sure. I mean, first of all, thanks for getting that, because I've never really wanted to be like a political journalist. Like I I care about politics. I care who wins elections and that sort of stuff. But I never wanted to cover politics for a living. I mean, don't tell my bosses necessarily that, but it was never my goal. I like to write about people, and I like to think about kind of profiles of the most interesting people doing the most interesting things, having drama and, narrative arcs and all that. And in covering politics, I think that's sort of one thing I do slightly differently than most political journalists, is that I think about them first as people and second as kind of political animals. And those two things are in alignment a lot of the time.
A lot of people in your book cry with you.
Yeah, there's crying in this book for sure. And so the story you're talking about is about Ian Walters, who was a spokesman for Matt Schlapp, who runs CPAC. And they have this big kind of dramatic breakup. Matt Schlapp is this Trump loyalist who used to be an establishment kind of George W. Bush type Republican, becomes this, MAGA, whatever. Like all he wants to do is be as close to Trump as humanly possible. And sycophant. And his spokesman was down for that ride for a very long time, and eventually breaks up and quits the job that he has working at CPAC, which is the big political action conference that happens every year, now multiple times a year. And he met his wife at CPAC. I mean, this is like his life. And he wanted Matt Schlapp to be the godfather to his children.
He's a father figure.
Yeah, his father. Like, he looked at this guy and was like, this is the family. He raises a family the way I want to. And they break up. And part of it is because he wasn't comfortable with Trump and the kind of the MAGA movement and Matt Gaetz and Marjorie Taylor Greene and all these people becoming, major figures at the conference. But that wasn't the real reason.
Yeah.
I mean, the real reason is because their friendship frayed. They stopped trusting each other. They had a weird scene in which a guy who maybe pretends to be the heir to a fortune comes and works at CPAC.
There's like a usurper.
It's very weird. It's this young guy who comes into CPAC and sort of takes Ian's job. And the personal breaks that they have, these little breaks, lead to the big break that is his kind of political reawakening and his quitting of his job and sending himself into the wilderness. And I think that's how politics works most of the time.
Totally.
It's people having petty grievances and fights and disagreements and, I can't work from home because I'm afraid of COVID, but you're not afraid of COVID. These are the things that make people decide, I'm no longer part of this movement anymore, more than an ideological shift often.
Yeah, and that somebody is bringing you in and you want to be part of the thing, and if you start to feel estranged from it, the pain of that, maybe that leads to some other revelations or career decisions, but it kind of comes from a place of this very universal pain that all stories are about, like losing your father or losing your lover or whatever it is. And it seems like he starts to see what happened at January 6th in a particular way because he was losing Matt Schlapp's affection as a father, not so much because there was an insurrection-y situation. It's less that.
Yeah, I mean, I part of me wonders if he and Matt had maintained their friendship, would he still be working there? And he's not. He's in the wilderness trying to figure out what to do next.
But was Matt capable of being that kind of a friend?
Yeah,
it's not all on CPAC Ian.
No, it's not at all. And Matt clearly was not. But like these people or hate these people, this is a book about people. It's a book about relationships and what the drama that people go through, more than it is about this person had an ideological shift and they could no longer talk to so-and-so and they were going back and they were reading all this political philosophy. No, it's about people who are this guy now sucks and I don't want to be a part of this anymore.
Yeah.
And that's when they start to think things through about where their politics are.
But then there's also you. You're in the mix. You're sitting at the poker table. One thing I'm never sure of is, are you drinking? In all of these scenes, are you also drinking?
Yeah, I had some drinks at some points during this, not a lot.
But I feel like it's a hard call.
Yeah, definitely not at any of the parties because
Okay.
it's too much. I would want these parties are awful to go to, and if I could drink there, I would drink so much there that I would forget that I'm there. Instead, it was just no drinking at all.
Mm-hmm.
At poker, I would have a beer probably. I didn't want to
And were you playing?
Yeah, I played not well. I played everyone knew I was a journalist. Sean invited me there as a journalist writing about him, and so my role I thought was very clear to everybody. Not everybody was happy with it later.
No doubt.
But, you know.
Because it doesn't read like a journalist is there,
Yeah.
which means that you're doing some very good work.
Yeah, I mean,
know.
yeah, I thought I was doing good work.
To make that happen, it's not easy.
Yeah, no, it's not. And look, I'm not undercover, right? Like I go there,
No, right.
I say, hey, Ben Terris, work at the Washington Post. I'm here because I'm writing about Sean. People think, oh, well, he's writing about Sean. Like I can say whatever the hell I want. And not writing about me. It's like, well, maybe I'll write about you. It depends how interesting you are.
Yeah, totally. And like when you're sitting, I mean, even with Ian and Matt Schlapp, you like go to lunch with them, and they're talking super frankly about sort of like which Republican congressmen are acceptable. Like, is it okay that this one went to the white nationalist event and can they come to our event now? And one of them is like, not to me. And then Matt Schlapp is like, I don't know, I think he's great. Like, it's just hard. It's sort of like you, at least as the reader, like you forget that there's like a guy sitting there who's not a part of this, like writing it all down.
Yeah, I mean, it surprises me sometimes. I actually yesterday was on the phone for another story I was working on at the Washington Post. Matt Gaetz called me, and he's in this book briefly, and he was angry
Florida Congressman.
about being in, Florida Congressman Matt Gaetz. He was angry that he was in this book. I make fun of him because he comes up to me at a party. He's wearing a red blazer. That's the same red blazer that Greta Van Susteren is wearing. And he says, please don't write in your book that I was wearing the same blazer as Greta Van Susteren. And so I wrote exactly that in the book, obviously, including him asking me not to put it in there. And when I talked to him on the phone for this other story, he was like, I was surprised to be made fun of in your book.
He's paying attention.
Yeah, well, he's like, I was surprised. Like, I thought we were just a couple people chatting at a party. And I was like, do you think I would go to that party, like, for fun? Like, I'm a reporter. Like, this is my job. I don't want to be there. And it was weird because that party, Brett Kavanaugh showed up at that party.
Right.
And then there was a Politico playbook item listing all the people that were there because Brett Kavanaugh showing up to a party is weird. And I was on that.
Or maybe it's not weird.
Maybe it's not. I don't know. And my name was on that Politico playbook thing. And then all sorts of people in my life were messaging me like, what are you doing there? Like my grandmother texted me. And I was like, I was there to work. Like, why does nobody think I'm going these places to work?
I texted you. I was like, this is so Washington. Like, you were there?
Yeah, I was there. It was weird. But I was there to work. I wasn't just there for fun. Like,
yeah. But I guess, like, in speaking about the sort of personal relationships that shape the politics, just your personal relationship with these people. I don't exactly know which one of them I would want to ask you about. I mean, like, definitely there's this, like, lobbyist who tries to be a lobbyist for Belarus at a certain point. Like, he's really just trying to make a buck, I think, taking these opportunities that seem to be coming up. But he drinks a lot of whiskey, and I'm always wondering if, like, you're drinking whiskey with him because he's driving around his, like, vast estate. And I'm wondering if he thinks that you're like his friend that he's confiding in. Not that you're presenting yourself falsely, but what do you do if you feel like that's happening?
yeah, so this is a really interesting character in the book. His name is Robert
Thanks.
Strick.
Yeah.
He is a cowboy hat wearing, ostrich boot wearing
The
lobbyist who
yeah,
works
showman.
lives on a farm called Alibi Farm outside of town. Like, he said the name came with the place, but like, it's a little too perfect for this guy. He gets contracts with kind of unseemly foreign actors. And yeah, he drinks a lot of whiskey. And when I was out there with him, I had the voice recorder going. Like, we didn't know each other before this. I was purely there for journalism purposes, and there was never any doubt that's what was going on. It was an interview, and when he wanted to go off the record, he'd ask to go off the record, and I'd press pause. I think in his case, not a lot of guys took this guy seriously. I mean, his story is fascinating. He was a lobbyist for a long time before Trump and didn't really make it work. Used some connections that he had from the Trump campaign in 2016 to just become one of the most successful lobbyists, like, in all of Washington. Like, tens of millions of dollars into his bank account. It all started because a dog sniffed his crotch at 4 a.m. at the Four Seasons Hotel after Trump won, and the owner of the dog came running over and was apologetic. And turned out she worked for the New Zealand embassy, and she was having trouble connecting her boss with the new president because everybody was expecting Hillary Clinton was going to be president, and nobody had connections to Trump.
He's so emblematic of that weird moment where, like, everyone had their Hillary Clinton binder and, like, no one knew what to do.
Exactly, yeah. And he was like, oh, I can connect you. And he didn't know if he could, but then he did. And he was off to the races, made tons and tons of money. And so I wanted to spend time with him because, A, it's like, this is a guy who figured out how to get rich in Trump's Washington. What happens to him in Biden's Washington? Like, could he make it work? And I don't think anyone ever took him seriously. And I was there asking him questions about his philosophy. And I wanted to know. I wasn't just there, for fun again. Like, I wanted to know what made him tick, like what he thought was right about Washington, wrong about Washington, how much Washington had changed. And I think he was just willing to open up to me because of that, because most people didn't care enough to ask him like what he thought about stuff. He was, he got kicked out of high school. He never graduated from high school. He did then go to college for a little while, but I think maybe got kicked out of college too, or he left college. And so people didn't take him seriously, and I did. Eventually, he wanted out of the book, and that became very contentious, and that's in there.
Yeah.
So
like, it seems like he thought you were going to be like, oh, okay, man, like, that's cool.
Yeah, I think he thought...
I don't have to, like, use all the material that I've been gathering about you.
Right. There was he had stories he wanted to tell, and I was going to tell them how I saw fit. And eventually he was like, oh, maybe he's not going to tell them the way I think. And I also did my own reporting, on the outside of our conversations. And I found a lot of stuff about him that once I asked him about that, he was like, oh, I'm not sure I realized you were going to go into that part of my past, or like into the time I ran for mayor of a small town in Northern California and it went horribly wrong and everybody hated me. Like, I didn't realize you were going to ask about that.
Yeah.
And so
you're going really deep on this rando.
Yeah.
Which is cool.
It was, I thought so.
But yeah, I mean, that's what's special is going so deep in with all these characters that it does make me wonder sometimes if like they forgot a journalist was in the room. But I feel like I have that question about a lot of your stories too. Like, I would say there was a huge story in your life about Kellyanne Conway and George Conway's marriage that was in the style section. When? 2017?
Yeah, 2018, yeah.
2018. I mean, that was that was an amazing story, and you ended up at their beach house, and it was a great example of like how this whole thing that we're trying to talk about. You talk about very eloquently that I'm kind of stumbling around this, like, personal relationships are actually the thing that's making up our politics. This is like the embodiment of that story. First of all, can you just like say what that story was? But then also I wondered if it changed your journalism after that story came out. Did it change the way you did other stories?
So that story was about kind of their marriage, George and Kellyanne. It was an early story of that genre.
You have to remember how often Kellyanne was on TV at the time.
Yeah,
like, she was with us.
Right,
all
and
the
how
time.
often George was tweeting.
Yeah.
And nobody really had spent any time with them. I became kind of like their marriage counselor in a way that you're talking about, where they would both kind of open up to me separately a lot and talk about each other, and then I would be like, well, George said this to you, or Kellyanne said this about you, and eventually they did not like that either. Like,
at one point, Kellyanne is like, as a source familiar,
right,
and you're like, you can't do that now,
right,
when you're talking to me in the middle of the conversation.
Kellyanne Conway tried to go on background with me. She tried to say, here's a thing that's awful about my husband, but you can't say I said it. And I said to her basically, but you just said it, and I can put that and what you're saying right now into this article. And she said no, and I was like, but yeah, like, you can't. And this is one of these things about, going off the record. This is like, insider journalism baseball here, but like, going off the record is a contract, basically. Somebody has to ask to go off the record, and then you can say, yeah, you can go off the record, and then they're off the record. Like, you're not going to be a jerk at that point and then print something that they said off the record. But you can't just say something and then later say, and by the way, that was off the record. And Kellyanne tried to do that with me, and I think she got away with that with lots of beat reporters.
She's a professional spokesperson.
That's her job, and I think a lot of people relied on her, and they'd be like, all right, fine, I'm not going to burn this bridge. I didn't rely on her at all. I mean, the beauty of my job is I can write about somebody, and then if they never want to talk to me ever again, that's fine. I'll just find somebody else to write about. And so in that way, I mean, I think that's sort of always how I did my job, but it was a realization that, like, I'm not out there to intentionally make people look like idiots. I mean, they can do that themselves sometimes, but it's not the goal. But it did make me realize, like, this is they it is their story, and it's important to try to tell it truthfully and not be hiding the ball all the time.
Right.
But ultimately, like, I get to tell the true story that I believe is the most true story. And I think that kind of gave me some confidence to write this book, which is not everyone's going to love how they were portrayed in this book. All I can promise is I'm going to take them seriously. I'm going to put everything in context. I'm going to be as nuanced in telling the story as I can. And if you kind of come across like a Veep character at the end of it, like, maybe that's not totally my fault. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I do feel like that is this like weird white whale that a lot of us are chasing after, like, is basically the thing that we love so much in Veep, where you're actually inside the room and I mean, it's not actually a documentary, but like but it feels, as close as you can get, kind of, because like they can say the things that sort of are true that you would never actually get. Like, a journalist can't get there. And that's true in Succession also, I feel like. Like, that's the story that I would want to tell about Fox, but like I can't get actually that close to that relationship between their father and them. And it's like, I feel like we're on this quest to do that with the real people, saying actual real things, like not out of a writer's room. And like, you're like almost there. Like, you're like getting to this promised land of like getting to the truth of what's happening in the rooms between people.
Yeah, I mean, this book is like the hardest I've ever worked on anything, and it's the most time I've ever spent with characters, and I am really proud of it. And I think what I'm most proud of is like it has some of everything. Like, there's relationships that are being built. There's people trying to have kids and trying to like start a family, and there's people who have a family trying to figure out how to raise them, and there's people going through breakups, both with significant others, but with friends or with family-like members, with the past versions of themselves. It's just like, it's really hard in political journalism to find these kinds of characters for the newspaper, right? Where you can write a whole story where it's like, here's a year with somebody, and it's like most of what they've went through. And so it was really hard to find the people, but I think most of these people in the book are a part of this big story, either actually physically there, part of the big story, or what they go through is part of the big story of what it is to be in Washington right now.
I want to let people ask questions, but like, let me ask, this is like kind of cheating to ask you this. But so when you look at, here we are, I mean, there was like a hard moment, I feel like, after Trump for some reporters who, in the same way that some of the characters in your book are like kind of lost without him, some reporters are kind of lost without him. Like, he provided, it was like there was a fire, and we were all like running around like trying to deal with it. And then without the fire, you're like, wait, where am I going? Or what should I focus on? I don't know if you had that kind of a moment, but like next we have like another election. There's always another election. And I guess like when you look over there, like when you like peek over at 2024 and it's like maybe going to be these same two old guys, I don't know, is there anything interesting?
I hope so. I mean, I don't know what it is right now. I dread it, honestly. The idea of the same,
It's scary, right?
It's scary, both just because like we don't know how it's gonna, like, as a country it's scary because two people that old, like, anything could happen. Mm-hmm. As a journalist, it's like, let's find some new people to write about. But
right.
There's always something. The situation is different now, and it's just about finding the new angles to the old stories.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I can ask you a million more things, but I'll let people ask you some things first if they want to. And how does it work? Do people have to come up to this microphone? Okay. And do I have to call on them, or you guys are just going to come?
They can just line up.
Okay.
Hi. Yeah, this is Ben. Thank you. I enjoyed listening to you both. I'm just wondering whether you feel that your access to, one, the sorts of people that are profiled in the book, that are written about in the book, and as well as access to more principal players, the candidates themselves and so forth, will suffer as a result of this? What do you feel is, do you fear for your level of access now at all, or do you feel it's perhaps gained?
It's a great question, and I don't know. I mean, yeah, part of me fears all the time that nobody will ever want to talk to me again. I wouldn't talk to me. But also, I wouldn't talk to anybody because the idea of being profiled is terrifying. I think in Washington, there's lots of reasons to talk to journalists, myself included. I mean, some people do believe that all press is good press. Being in this book might be good for people, even if I read it as like, oof, I wouldn't want to be written that way. They're still players, right? And in Washington, being a player sometimes matters more than, in which way you're portrayed. I think about Mark Leibovich's book from 2012, This Town, 2013. Kurt Bardella is one of these characters in his book that I thought was an embarrassing portrayal. He was a figure who worked for a Republican congressman, and Mark Leibovich, who's a great writer, kind of makes fun of him throughout, I thought. And now he's a bigger player in Washington than ever. And so it's possible that it doesn't really matter as long as you're written about in some way. I also truly believe that I will give people a better shake than a lot of journalists do, partially because of time. I'm able to spend time with people. I'm able to write with more length in the Washington Post feature section, the style section, than most people can. And a lot of journalists have to go and if they're going to profile somebody, they grab the sexiest quote and they throw it on top, and that's kind of the whole story. I can tell people I'm going to listen to you and think things through and talk to you and everyone you know, and if you're up for that challenge, I think I'm going to give you the most honest shake that anyone's going to give you. And I think that people believe that, and I think it's true.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Which parties and which politicians did COVID benefit the most?
I've never really thought about COVID as benefiting anybody, so I don't know. Is it okay to say I just have no idea?
Yeah.
I'm not sure it benefited anybody. I think it was one of these things that was so destabilizing that it's hard to trust anything at this point. And so people have reasons to feel like this country has let them down, and whether you're Republican or Democrat, I think you suffer from that just because, this country is supposed to make people feel safe.
Hi, thank you for coming out today, and I'm excited to read your book. But what 3 words would you use to describe Washington right now, the scene in Washington?
Ooh, this is like a quiz.
3 words?
You can do 5 if you really want.
3 is enough. It's hard to think of 3 words. Confused. I want to say lost, but that's basically the same thing. So that's 1.5. And despondent.
Yeah, I was going to say hopeless.
Yeah.
But I don't live here.
Thank you. Thanks.
Hi. So it sounds like the years that your book covers kind of overlaps with the beginning of this new 6-3 Republican Supreme Court. And I was wondering if the dynamics on that new court or any of their decisions impacted any of the characters in your book.
Yeah, great question. I mean, certainly the striking down of Roe v. Wade was huge for all of Washington, right? I mean, it changed politics in that moment in ways that people didn't even realize at the time, but clearly, you could see it in how the election went. And so a lot of the people in this book are focused on trying to get people elected or, chart a path for their parties. And so I think when that happened, everybody was like, okay, how do we message this? How do we either use this to our advantage? There were progressives I talked to who were like, this is horrible. I want to say this is horrible, but also maybe this will benefit us, right? I mean, in Washington, it's like, how can we take advantage of a crisis? And so I think there was a lot of crisis advantage taking in that moment.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi. I'm really curious about how you decided on the book structure. So it's in chronological order rather than a profile of each character that you follow closely. How did you land on the chronological aspect rather than the one chapter or a deep dive?
Yeah, that was the hardest part of the whole book. I mean, my job at the paper is to write profiles. And so in my mind, it was like, okay, how many words do I have to turn into a publisher? How many words is an article? How many articles is this? And so when I was starting out, it was like, can I just write, 12 profiles? But then it didn't feel like a book if I did that, right? I mean, and it could have been good. I mean, it could have been an interesting series of profiles. But I wanted it to feel like this was a profile of Washington. And if it was a bunch of profiles of people on their own, I'm not sure it would have felt that way, at least to me. And so it took a lot of time to figure out how to organize it, because not everyone in this book is spending quality time with each other. Some do. There's overlap. But a lot of people are just sort of tangentially related to one another. And so chronological made sense because that way you could see the things that they were responding to, the Supreme Court decisions, the polling that comes out, the gambling that people are making at the poker table, and it pays off, and all of a sudden Sean has new pink shoes, and people are talking about it all over town or whatever. To put it in chronological order just felt like the easiest way to kind of be a guidebook through Washington. I just felt like there was a chance that you could read it from the beginning to the end and feel like you were carried all the way through that way.
Thank you.
Did you try experiment with other structures besides this one?
It was not so much by the time I was putting the book together, but I did certainly write profiles. And then I was like, can I cut this up? Can I make these into tiny little chapters? I got great advice from Howard Yoon, who's in the back, to turn everything into little chapters, and that way I could at least figure out where everything went. And then ultimately, little chapters kind of ruled. You could get to the end and be like, oh, I just read a whole chapter? I can go to bed tonight. This is great.
No, that's true. I totally had that experience. And there were people that you spent a lot of time with, right? But they didn't, for some reason, figure in the book. Mm-hmm. And why? What? Can you just tell me about what happened with one of those people that you decided to draw?
Yeah, there was a great guy who I thought was going to be the best character in the book. He was a national security advisor for the Republican Senator Tommy Tuberville. So Tommy Tuberville is a former football coach, now the Senator of Alabama, not necessarily known as the brightest bulb in the Senate. And he has a national security advisor, had a national security advisor named Morgan Murphy, who, if you look him up on Wikipedia, it doesn't say Morgan Murphy, parentheses, national security advisor. It says Morgan Murphy, parentheses, food critic. And he was that. He was a food critic. He got his start working for Graydon Carter at Vanity Fair. He said he was personal assistant to Graydon Carter, but it turned out he was maybe just an intern.
How many people say that?
Yeah, probably a lot of people. And he became a food writer and ate his way through the South and was on QVC and was just this really, he was a raconteur. He would wear 3-piece suits. And he was the most fascinating guy to be around. He knew how to tell a story. He lived at the Willard Hotel for a while during COVID. He worked at the Pentagon during January 6th and would tell these stories about being in the office with the Secretary of Defense while Nancy Pelosi was calling and, scared about whatever. He was he called himself Forrest Gump, basically, and he was sort of everywhere. And I thought, how can you not write about this guy in a book? The problem with him is he's a great profile subject, but a book does need to have a narrative arc that carries you from, the first date in the book till the end.
He wasn't trying to do something.
Nothing happened with him. I mean, he was there and he was advising the senator, and then nothing really happened enough to make him, have a, one of these journeys of self-discovery that leads to an active process of change. That's something I learned in 6th grade and is still in my head as what makes a good story.
Yeah.
And I think about that sometimes. He didn't have any of that. He was the same guy at the beginning of the year and the end of the year. Mm-hmm. Ultimately, I wrote about him in the paper because he was involved with...
I know, then something did happen.
Yeah, he lost his job because I wrote an article about him. But that didn't make it into the book.
Exactly. I don't know. You guys want to buy the book?
Well, thanks so much for coming. This was, a treat. This is my favorite bookstore.